You can have a wedding anytime, Amelia Sterling. My sister said that 6 weeks before my wedding, like she was choosing brunch. She said it so casually, as if my vows were flexible, as if the day I had built with love could bend around her convenience. Then Celeste Sterling booked her baby shower on my wedding day, same date, same hour, and acted like nothing about that was cruel. One by one, my entire family followed her without hesitation, as if choosing her was the most natural thing in the world. My mother went, my aunts went, my cousins went. Even my father chose finger sandwiches over walking me down the aisle. 7 people showed up to my wedding. 417 messages appeared only after they realized what they had missed. If this story touches something raw in you, stay with me, because the empty chairs were only the beginning. My name is Amelia Sterling. I was 28, in love, and still naive enough to believe blood meant loyalty. To understand what happened that day, I have to take you back 6 months to a Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything. That was the night my father looked my future husband in the eye and told him he would never amount to anything. In the Sterling family, there was one rule no one said aloud, yet everyone obeyed it anyway. Everything revolved around Celeste Sterling, her moods, her status, her comfort, and whatever version of reality benefited her most. My father, Richard Sterling, had spent 31 years as a branch manager at a regional bank in Hartford. He was steady, respectable, and proud of being the kind of man who wore the same 3 ties on rotation. He called that discipline. I eventually learned he also called avoidance wisdom whenever courage became inconvenient. My mother, Diane Sterling, stayed home, hosted book clubs, and kept our house in perfect display condition. White colonial, black shutters, hydrangeas along the walkway. From the outside, we looked polished and deeply respectable. Inside, though, the numbers told the real story, and every number in that house pointed toward my sister. Celeste Sterling married Bradford Hale 5 years earlier, and after that, she became family royalty. The Hale family owned commercial real estate in Fairfield County, and at that time, Bradford Hale looked golden. He bought Celeste Sterling a Lexus SUV, expensive jewelry, and most importantly, my parents' permanent loyalty. He paid the mortgage on the Glastonbury house, funded the kitchen renovation, and covered costs no one discussed openly. He handed my mother a supplementary credit card, and from then on, her gratitude developed a very specific direction. In return, the entire Sterling family treated Celeste Sterling like she had won an award for excellence in existence. My sister had not earned a real paycheck in years, but in my family, marrying rich counted as achievement. Then there was me, Amelia Sterling, the younger daughter with paint on her hands and an unstable income. I freelanced as an illustrator, children's books, editorial pieces, quiet work that rarely impressed people who loved titles. I lived in a rented studio in New Haven with stained counters, secondhand furniture, and bills that changed monthly. I never resented that Celeste Sterling married wealth. I resented that her marriage made everyone forget I existed. I met Julian Vale at an art fair in New Haven 3 years before the wedding. He was standing in front of one of his own paintings, glaring at it like the canvas had offended him personally. I laughed. He turned. Something in his eyes, quiet, focused, and entirely real, made me stop. Julian Vale painted portraits and urban scenes in oil, luminous, patient work that made people fall silent. The art world called his talent rare. My family called it not a real job, which told me enough. He sold pieces through smaller galleries and took commissions when they came. Some months were better than others. Some months we ate a lot of pasta and pretended that thrift was an aesthetic choice rather than survival. But we were building something honest together, and that mattered more to me than prestige ever could. My family never saw it that way, and Thanksgiving proved how little effort they made to hide it. 8 months before the wedding, I brought Julian Vale to my parents' house in Glastonbury for dinner. Celeste Sterling arrived in the Lexus carrying 2 bottles of Napa Cabernet and made sure everyone heard the price. I brought a pie I baked from scratch. My mother placed the wine on the dining table with ceremony. She never mentioned the pie. Small things tell the truth long before the big things do. Over turkey, my father leaned toward Julian Vale wearing that smile men use right before they wound you politely. "So, Julian Vale," he asked, "when are you getting a real job?" The table responded exactly how I feared. Bradford Hale chuckled. Celeste Sterling tilted her head and coated the moment in sweet little pity. "At least Amelia Sterling has someone," she said. like companionship was the consolation prize for being the lesser daughter. Julian Vale said nothing. He just reached under the table, found my hand, and squeezed once. What nobody knew that night was that something extraordinary had already begun moving quietly beneath our lives. Our landlord, Theodore Bennett, had started paying close attention to Julian Vale long before I understood why. Theodore Bennett was 67, silver-haired, quiet, and easy to overlook unless you noticed how carefully he watched. He owned the old Victorian on Elm Street where Julian Vale and I rented the ground-floor live work studio. $800 a month for 12-foot ceilings and north-facing windows was absurd, even by New Haven standards. When I asked why the rent was so low, Theodore Bennett shrugged and said he preferred artists in the building. To me, he was simply a kind landlord who let us pay late once and brought tomatoes in August. But he had a habit of wandering downstairs to watch Julian Vale work with coffee in hand. He would stand beside the easel and say things like, "Push the light on the jaw warmer, half a degree." Julian Vale would adjust the painting, and suddenly the whole image would sharpen into something undeniable. One afternoon, Theodore Bennett told him his work reminded him of someone he once represented who sold for 6 figures. I smiled politely and assumed he was just being generous, because I still did not know who he had been. Around the same time, he mentioned that a friend wanted to see more of Julian Vale's recent work. He asked if Julian Vale could photograph a few pieces and send them over, and I thought little of it. I assumed it was a small gallery or maybe a regional collector with decent taste and moderate reach. One evening, while I washed brushes, Theodore Bennett told me the world eventually finds honest talent. He said it just takes longer when the person making the work refuses to become fake for attention. I should have asked more questions, but I was too busy worrying about the wedding and my family. In January, Julian Vale proposed while we were lying on the studio floor among unfinished canvases. Snow was falling outside. The room smelled like paint, wood, and winter. It was the most us moment possible. There was no diamond ring at first. Only a soft question asked without performance or perfect timing. Later, Julian Vale carved me a ring from reclaimed walnut wood, and it was more beautiful than anything expensive. We set the date for June 14th, a small garden ceremony near Mystic, Connecticut. Nothing extravagant. 42 guests, wildflowers, an arch Julian Vale was building himself from salvaged wood. I called my parents that weekend to share the news, still hoping love might sound different once spoken aloud. My father's first response was not congratulations. He simply said, "June 14th? Let me check." 2 days later, Richard Sterling called back and said he would be there and walk me down the aisle. I held that promise like glass, bright and fragile, because I wanted so badly to trust it. My mother asked how much the wedding was costing before she asked whether I was happy. She never asked about the dress, the flowers, or how it felt to choose a life with Julian Vale. Celeste Sterling sent one short text. "Congrats. Let me know if you need help with anything." Then silence. No follow-up. No phone call, no venue suggestions from the woman who called herself an event planner. Julian Vale and I did everything ourselves, and somehow that made the wedding feel more intimate. I designed every invitation by hand, watercolor wildflowers on cream cardstock, each one slightly different. I thought about Celeste Sterling's wedding, 300 guests, gold foil invitations, a 12-piece band. Ours was smaller, yes, but it was ours, and I loved every imperfect handmade inch of it. I should have known something was wrong when Celeste Sterling never once challenged the date. My sister always had an opinion. Her silence was never peace. It was preparation. 3 weeks before the wedding, my Aunt Patricia Monroe called and casually detonated my world. "Honey, are you going to Celeste Sterling's shower too, or just the wedding? They're the same day, right?" I stood frozen in the kitchen while turquoise paint dripped from my brush onto the floor. "What shower?" I asked, though part of me already understood that the answer would be deliberate. Patricia Monroe explained there was a baby shower on June 14th at a country club in Greenwich. I had not received an invitation, which told me more than any explanation would have. I called Celeste Sterling immediately. She answered on the 3rd ring, bright, smooth, and perfectly rehearsed. She said Bradford Hale had booked a venue that only had June 14th available, and now everything was locked. The caterer was booked. The rentals were booked. The date, she said, was simply unfortunate and impossible to move. Then she asked if maybe people could do both events, as if geography might soften itself for her convenience. My wedding was at 3 in Mystic. Her shower was at noon in Greenwich, over 90 minutes away. No one could do both. She knew it. I knew it. Every road map in Connecticut knew it. The baby shower would be at Greenwich Country Club with valet parking, French catering, and monogrammed gift bags. She described those details like weather, as if the cruelty belonged to logistics, not her choice. Then Patricia Monroe confirmed the part that settled in my stomach like a stone and stayed there. Celeste Sterling had sent her baby shower invitations 2 weeks before I mailed my save the dates. She had known my wedding date for months. She chose that day anyway and moved first. When I confronted her, she sweetly said this was her first baby and I should understand that. Then she gave me the sentence I would hear in my head for years afterward. "You can have a wedding any time, Amelia Sterling." She said it like she was being reasonable. I called my mother first because somewhere inside me a younger daughter still believed fairness might matter. Diane Sterling paused before answering, and that pause already contained everything she was about to deny. She said Celeste Sterling really needed the family there because this was the first grandchild for them. I reminded her that my wedding had been planned for months, with deposits paid and invitations already sent. She suggested maybe I could postpone a few weeks, as if vows were a lunch booking. When I said the deposits were non-refundable, she replied that maybe not everyone needed to be at both. Some people at my wedding, some at the shower, as if love could be split and still called love. I called my father next. Richard Sterling did what he always did when faced with discomfort. He deflected. He said he would talk to my mother and that they would figure it out. He did not call back for 3 days. I texted him asking if he was still walking me down the aisle. I watched the read receipt appear. The blue check stared back at me like a closed door. He said nothing. I called again and again until he finally answered on the 3rd attempt. He told me, of course, he would still be there, but the promise sounded hollow now. It felt like a line he was reading, not a choice he meant to keep. That week, I counted the RSVPs and learned exactly where I stood inside my own family. Out of 38 relatives invited, 22 had already declined, and every one of them was going to Greenwich. I did not beg. I asked once, clearly, because I wanted the truth in the only language that matters. Their answer came through silence, excuses, and maybe not everyone needs to be there, and I understood enough. My best friend, Naomi Carter, was the one who showed me the full picture behind the betrayal. She had been added to the family group chat years earlier, and thankfully no one ever removed her. Because Naomi Carter is Naomi Carter, she screenshotted everything without apology and brought me receipts. She sat me down in the studio and showed me how carefully Celeste Sterling had worked. Not one group text, not one casual mention. She made individual calls to each relative, one by one. To my mother, Celeste Sterling said that if she chose my wedding, it meant she did not care about the baby. To Patricia Monroe, she said Bradford Hale's mother would be there and our side could not look embarrassing. To my father, she said something that cracked something so deep in me I still hear it. In the group chat, Celeste Sterling wrote, "Amelia Sterling will understand. She's used to being disappointed." My own sister typed that with her thumbs and pressed send, and somehow still saw herself as the victim. But the deepest cut was not just emotional, it was financial, and Naomi Carter made me see that clearly. Bradford Hale paid my parents' mortgage $3,200 a month like a leash disguised as generosity. He covered groceries, clothes, salon visits, and the version of comfort my parents had begun to depend on. No one had to say the threat directly. If they crossed Celeste Sterling, the money could stop. My family was not only emotionally obedient, they were financially owned, and everyone knew it. Then Naomi Carter showed me one last message from Celeste Sterling, and it stripped away every pretense. She wrote that my wedding was so small it was barely an event, just a painter in a garden. "It's not like there's a reception at the Ritz," she wrote, and that told me exactly who she was. That night, Julian Vale and I sat in the studio while summer hummed outside through the open windows. He cleaned brushes under the warm lamp and quietly told me we did not need them to make it real. Then he added the part that hurt because it was kind. He knew I still wanted my father there. I stared at a painting he had been working on, a lone chair in an empty room lit by soft afternoon light. It was not meant to be about me, but somehow it already was, before either of us knew how, literally. That night, I sent one final message to every invited family member. Nothing dramatic, only facts. Date, time, address, directions, and at the end, one line. I hope to see you there. I pressed send at 10:47 p.m. and waited for even one person to answer with something human. No one replied. Not a parent, not an aunt, not a cousin, not even the cowards who called themselves kind. The next morning, Naomi Carter called from Chicago and told me she had already booked a flight. I'll be there, she said. I will always be there. She did not ask about the others. June 14th was 12 days away. I had a dress, flowers, 42 chairs, and a wedding worth showing up for. What I did not have was a single family member who chose me freely, clearly, and without pressure. But something inside me had shifted. I no longer wanted to beg for scraps and call them love. On the morning of my wedding, at 7 o'clock, Naomi Carter sat on my bathroom counter doing my makeup. She called it hospital-grade precision, and I was trying very hard to breathe like a normal person. My bouquet of white peonies and lavender sat in a mason jar on the kitchen table. My dress hung from the closet door, and the room looked exactly like hope before it gets tested. Then my phone buzzed. It was Richard Sterling, and Naomi Carter looked at my face before I answered. My father's voice sounded sanded down. He said he did not know how to say what he was about to say. Then he told me that he and my mother could not make it to Mystic after Celeste Sterling's shower. I counted 8 seconds of silence, and those 8 seconds held the architecture of my whole childhood. Every Father's Day card, every "Dad, look what I made," every time I believed I mattered, all of it collapsed. "You promised," I said, and I am proud that my voice did not shake. He said he knew, but this was Celeste Sterling's first baby, and I would have other moments. I told him this was my only wedding day. There would not be another one waiting behind it. He said not to make this harder than it had to be, as if I were the one doing harm. I hung up, placed the phone face down on the counter, and watched my hands tremble while my eyes stayed dry. Naomi Carter said nothing. She just picked up the mascara wand and kept going because she knew. Later that morning, she checked Instagram and showed me what my sister had already posted. Pink balloons, gold streamers, a venue being decorated, and the caption, "So grateful to have the whole family here." It was only 9 in the morning, 3 hours before the shower even started, but the message was clear. I did not scream. I did not cry. I only understood that the last thread had snapped. Our venue sat behind a small inn in Mystic overlooking a salt marsh that turned silver in the afternoon. Julian Vale had spent 2 weekends building the arch from salvaged oak, eucalyptus, and white ribbon. It was simple. It was beautiful. It was made by hands that loved me, and that mattered. I arrived at 2:15 and saw the white chairs already arranged in neat rows with lavender tied to each one. From a distance, it looked like a beautiful wedding. Up close, 35 empty chairs looked brutal. 7 people came. Julian Vale, Naomi Carter, Daniel Cross, Lena Hart, Theodore Bennett, 2 college friends. The wind moved through the empty rows and rustled the lavender like the garden was trying to fill the silence. I stood at the end of the aisle in my vintage lace dress, and every empty seat felt like a bruise. The musicians began Pachelbel, and the music drifted over the marsh in a way that hurt and healed at once. Naomi Carter stepped toward me and offered to walk me down the aisle if I wanted. I told her no because she was my maid of honor and belonged beside Julian Vale, not replacing my father. I turned to face the aisle, ready to walk alone, and then I heard slow, steady footsteps behind me. "I believe I'm overdressed for a garden party," a voice said, and I turned to see Theodore Bennett. He stood 3 feet behind me in a navy 3-piece suit I had never seen him wear. It was beautifully cut, clearly old, clearly treasured, with a pale blue pocket square and silver cufflinks. Later, I would notice the engraving on them, but in that moment all I saw was steadiness. Then Theodore Bennett extended his arm and asked if I would let an old man have the honor. Something broke open in my chest then, not the sharp kind of breaking, but the kind that lets light in. I told him he did not have to do this. I still did not know how to accept being chosen. He answered gently that he knew he did not have to. He simply wanted to. Then he said the sentence I needed more than anything that day. My father should have been there, he said, but since he was not, someone who valued me should be. I took Theodore Bennett's arm, and together we walked down the aisle my father abandoned. All 7 guests stood. Naomi Carter was already crying. Julian Vale pressed his hand over his mouth. The ceremony lasted 12 minutes, officiated by a retired judge Julian Vale knew from a community art project. We said our vows in a garden full of missing people and somehow made the moment fuller than they ever could have. Julian Vale wrote his vows on a piece of primed canvas. I wrote mine on the back of one of my illustrations. We both cried. We both laughed. 7 people clapped, and somehow that was enough. In that garden, on that June afternoon, I learned that enough does not always look impressive from far away. Sometimes enough is 7 people, one chosen family, and a stranger who steps into the place blood left empty. After the ceremony, we held the reception in the same garden under the slow arrival of evening light. There was no ballroom, no 5-tier cake, no luxury package, only joy made from whatever we could carry. We ordered pizza from downtown Mystic. Naomi Carter brought 3 bottles of wine she loved. Daniel Cross connected his phone to a portable speaker and we danced on the grass until fireflies appeared. It was joyful. It was imperfect. It was ours. That matters more to me now than it did then. Later, when the music softened, I sat in one of the empty chairs and opened my phone. There were no messages from my family. Not one congratulations, not one apology, not one soft lie, nothing. It was as though the wedding had not happened. As though I had not happened. Against my better judgment, I opened Instagram and found 14 photos from Celeste Sterling's shower. Pink and gold balloons. A dessert table worth more than my flowers. Relatives laughing with champagne. My father stood beside Celeste Sterling, his hand on her belly, smiling like devotion had always been simple. The caption said, "Surrounded by love, family is everything." I read it twice. She typed that while I was saying my vows to 7 people and 35 empty chairs. In one background image, I noticed Bradford Hale turned away with a phone pressed to his ear. His jaw looked tight. He seemed stressed in a room built for celebration, but I filed it away. That night, back in the studio, Julian Vale and I lay on the old futon by the open windows. We had taken the lavender from the chairs and placed it in jars all over the apartment. The whole studio smelled like the wedding had followed us home and refused to leave quietly. Julian Vale stared at the ceiling and told me he had married the most talented, stubborn, beautiful woman he knew. Then he said he would not trade our garden with 7 witnesses for a ballroom with 300 people. I told him maybe if I had tried harder, called one more time, done one more thing, they might have come. He told me I had called enough, more than enough, and closed that door with gentle certainty. Then the grief shifted. I stopped grieving only for myself and started grieving for what they had done to him too. He had stood at the end of that aisle watching his bride walk toward him with her landlord. He deserved a family cheering for us. He deserved better than empty chairs and silence. I whispered that he deserved a real wedding, and he answered that this had been real. He said Theodore Bennett was there. Naomi Carter was there. That was more family than blood had given me. I cried then quietly into his shoulder, not because I was broken, but because I was tired. What I did not know was that Julian Vale had been carrying a secret that would change everything. A week passed, then another, and not a single member of my family reached out. On day 8, I sent one final message and typed it carefully before pressing send. I thanked them for their silence because it had told me everything their words never would. I said I would not be reaching out again. And if they wanted to talk, they knew where to find me. 2 days later, my mother replied only to call me dramatic and insist they still loved me. No apology, no accountability. Just the old family weapon against anyone honest enough to feel pain aloud. I did not answer. I muted the chat and turned back to the only thing that had never betrayed me, the work. Julian Vale had started a new series he called The Seventh Chair. Large-format oil paintings about absence in intimate spaces where the empty place says more than the occupied ones. A dinner table set for 8 with 1 chair untouched. A church pew missing someone. A row of white chairs in a garden, lavender tied to every back, 35 of them holding only air. I knew exactly what the paintings were about. He did not need to explain anything. One afternoon, Theodore Bennett came downstairs and stood in front of the garden painting for a long time. His coffee went cold in his hand while he looked at it. Then he pulled out his phone and texted someone. He never said who. I did not ask. I had stopped chasing every closed door by then. I stopped waiting for an apology that was never coming and started building a life that did not need one. What I did not know was that something enormous was already being built for us behind the scenes. 2 weeks after the wedding, Theodore Bennett invited Julian Vale and me upstairs for coffee. Not casually, formally. 3 mugs, a French press, a cardboard box waiting on the kitchen table. He told us there was something he should have said a long time ago, then opened the box. Inside were exhibition catalogs, gallery materials, old photographs, and clipped articles from major art magazines. I recognized names from museums. I recognized paintings from textbooks. I did not recognize my landlord in any of it. Then Theodore Bennett explained that he had run Bennett Gallery in Chelsea for 22 years. He had represented 43 artists, and 7 of them were now in major museum collections. I stared at him, at the quiet man in corduroy who had charged us $800 a month. He said I never needed to know before because he wanted to be sure about Julian Vale first. He had spent his career learning the difference between competent and extraordinary, and Julian Vale was extraordinary. Then he told us the rest. 6 months earlier, he had sent photos of Julian Vale's work to Vincent Ashcroft. Vincent Ashcroft was a private collector whose holdings included works by artists that appeared in every serious catalog. He bought one painting immediately for $85,000, and my mind failed to hold that number. I looked at Julian Vale, and he nodded slowly, carrying months of silence in his face. He said he had planned to tell me after the wedding because he did not want money to become the story. Over the next several days, the full scale of it unfolded with signatures, lawyers, and contracts. Vincent Ashcroft's attorney sent a formal commission agreement for 12 original paintings over 18 months. Total contract value, $450,000, paid in stages tied to delivery milestones. Every term was laid out: payments, transit insurance, intellectual property, deadlines, protections, everything artists dream about. Attached was another letter from Caldwell Gallery on West 25th Street in Manhattan. They invited Julian Vale to hold a solo exhibition centered on the 7th Chair series. We drove to New York to sign the papers, and I sat in a leather chair reading every page twice. The numbers blurred. My hands shook, but not from fear, from the force of reality arriving all at once. I whispered that this contract was worth more than my father made in years at the bank. Theodore Bennett placed his hand on the table and said it was only the beginning. He said Vincent Ashcroft did not buy products. He built relationships and opened doors that stayed open. Julian Vale signed. The attorney notarized. Caldwell confirmed the exhibition schedule that same afternoon. It was real, legal, binding, documented. Not a fantasy, not a maybe. Not a miracle with strings attached. We told no one. My family still believed Julian Vale was a painter with poor prospects and no future. A week later, Vincent Ashcroft called Julian Vale directly while I was in the studio. His voice was warm and unhurried, the kind that comes from a life not ruled by panic. He said he understood we had not gotten the honeymoon we deserved and invited us onto his yacht in Monaco. The Meridian would be in the Mediterranean for 10 days, and he wanted us aboard as his guests. I whispered that we could not possibly accept something like that because old scarcity speaks loudly. Julian Vale reminded me that Theodore Bennett had said Vincent Ashcroft did this for artists he backed. It was relationship building, not pity. Professional generosity, not rescue. A different language than the one I was raised in. Then I thought about the 42 chairs, and every year I had made myself smaller to stay acceptable. I decided I was done shrinking so other people could remain comfortable in the lie that I mattered less. I said yes to Monaco. I said yes to being chosen. I said yes to not apologizing for receiving good things. When Naomi Carter found out, she laughed so hard she nearly choked on her coffee. She said I was going on a billionaire's yacht while my family still thought Julian Vale was broke. I told her I was not hiding anything. I had simply stopped performing my life for an audience that never clapped. Around the same time, something was shifting inside the world that had made Bradford Hale seem untouchable. Patricia Monroe texted that Bradford Hale's real estate company had hit a rough patch after failed developments. Financing had collapsed. The details were vague, but the consequences were not. Celeste Sterling's Lexus was gone and replaced by a used Honda CR-V, which felt symbolic in every direction. My sister, who posted online the way some people breathe, went silent for 2 straight weeks. For Celeste Sterling, That kind of silence was the social equivalent of smoke under a locked door. Then my mother called for the first time in over a month and invited Julian Vale and me to dinner. Her voice had that overly bright quality people use when the resource they prefer begins to dry up. I declined politely and stood there after hanging up, already understanding exactly why she had remembered me. When Bradford Hale's money was flowing, I did not exist. Now that it was slowing, I mattered again. 3 weeks later, one photograph would make Bradford Hale's money look like pocket change. We flew to Nice on a Tuesday morning in July with one suitcase, sketchbooks, and disbelief. When we boarded the Meridian, I realized it was not a boat. It was a floating cathedral. Our cabin had a private balcony, marble floors, Egyptian cotton sheets, and flowers waiting on the nightstand. I stood barefoot on the balcony in a linen dress from a market in Nice and watched Monaco drift by. The water looked so blue it seemed painted, as if Julian Vale had mixed it himself. On the third evening, Vincent Ashcroft hosted dinner on the upper deck for 8 guests, 2 collectors from London, a curator from the Tate, a Berlin critic, their partners, crystal, candles, white linen. The sky turned from orange to indigo, while the Mediterranean moved beneath us like polished glass. Then Vincent Ashcroft stood and introduced Julian Vale as the most exciting realist painter he had seen in decades. He announced the upcoming Caldwell exhibition, The Seventh Chair, and the whole table leaned in. Julian Vale described the series quietly, paintings about absence and the spaces left by people who do not show up. The Berlin critic leaned forward and said the work had biennale potential, and the table murmured in agreement. I sat beside my husband with my hand on his knee, and felt something in me settle for the first time. I was finally in a room where people recognized the value of what we had built without mocking its origin. Later, alone by the railing, Vincent Ashcroft told me my husband was gifted and I had known it first. I thanked him for seeing it too, because being witnessed by the right people heals quiet damage. On our last evening aboard the Meridian, I did something I almost never do. I posted on Instagram. In the photo, I stood at the bow in a white silk dress with Julian Vale behind me. Monaco blurred softly in the distance, and beside us sat a champagne glass and the Caldwell catalog. I captioned it simply, "Honeymoon with my husband," grateful for the people who showed up. No tags, no explanations, no drama. Just one sentence and one photograph that recorded the truth. I posted it at 9 p.m. European time, 3 a.m. on the East Coast, then put my phone away. The next morning, I reached for my phone out of habit and found the screen buried in notifications. 417 missed calls and text messages stared back at me from the family that ignored my wedding. The same people who could not send one message on June 14th suddenly had many urgent questions. My father called 23 times and texted asking whose yacht it was and why I had never told him. My mother wanted to celebrate when I got back, as though silence on my wedding day was a small accident. Celeste Sterling asked whether Julian Vale's art was actually selling and said we should talk soon. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and near strangers rushed in claiming they were proud and had always believed in us. At the bottom of the list was a message I had never expected to receive directly. Bradford Hale asked whether Julian Vale was represented by a gallery and said he would love to connect. The man whose money bought my family's loyalty was now trying to network through the sister-in-law he ignored. I read every message. I responded to none. Silence can become a boundary when the right person uses it. Later that day, I unlocked the family group chat for the first time since muting it. I wrote one honest message and revised it twice before sending it. I said Julian Vale had signed a major art commission 6 weeks earlier, and the yacht belonged to Vincent Ashcroft. I explained that our honeymoon had been a gift, and that yes, we were doing well. Then I said what mattered most. Their absence on June 14th hurt deeply, and I needed space. I wrote that my father had promised to walk me down the aisle and chose not to. I wrote that my mother chose a baby shower over her daughter's wedding. I wrote that my sister scheduled her event on my wedding day deliberately, and I would not pretend otherwise. I said I was not writing from anger but from clarity, and I would reach out when ready. Then I put the phone away again and let them sit with words they could not edit. For 4 hours, no one replied. I imagine they read the message around kitchen counters in guilty silence. My father called that night. I did not answer. I had spent too many years answering first. An hour later, Celeste Sterling posted a story of a beautifully set dinner table with one caption, 10, as if I had failed to attend, as if I were the one who abandoned something sacred. Some people never stop rewriting the story, even after the truth has already entered the room. 3 weeks after we returned from Monaco, Caldwell Gallery issued the official press release. Julian Vale's solo exhibition, The Seventh Chair, was announced to every major art publication that mattered. Art News ran a preview. ArtNet picked it up. Then came the one with the loudest echo, the New York Times. The feature showed Julian Vale standing beside the centerpiece of the exhibition. It was a garden rendered in luminous afternoon light beneath a salvaged wood arch threaded with eucalyptus. 42 white chairs stretched across the lawn. 7 were occupied by living figures painted with tenderness. The other 35 were empty, and sunlight fell across them like a question no one wanted to answer. The title was June 14th. The price was $120,000. It was already sold. Vincent Ashcroft had claimed it before the exhibition opened because he understood the power of witness. The article said the work explored familial absence and emotional displacement with devastating specificity. It mentioned Vincent Ashcroft. It mentioned Bennett Gallery. It used the word extraordinary about Julian Vale. On opening night, 200 people filled Caldwell Gallery, collectors, critics, curators, and people who knew what they were seeing. I stood beside Julian Vale in a simple black dress and watched strangers cry in front of our worst day. A reporter approached him and asked whether June 14th was autobiographical. Julian Vale did not hesitate. He said yes, it was his wedding day. 7 guests, 42 chairs. The room went quiet for a beat, and then the questions began, because truth on a public wall cannot be ignored. By morning, the story was everywhere, not because we planned revenge, but because truth had found a stage. My father saw the article first. Someone forwarded it. I never found out who. I imagine him sitting at the kitchen table in Glastonbury with his reading glasses on, staring at those chairs. My mother called and said he had not spoken in hours, that he was just sitting there. I told her I had not painted it. Julian Vale had. He painted what happened. She had no answer to that, because there is no defense against reality rendered carefully enough. Celeste Sterling reacted differently. She was not sad. She was furious that people were asking questions. Friends began asking why she had missed her sister's wedding if that painting was really based on family. The image she curated for years, loving sister, elegant daughter, center of the universe, began cracking visibly. Bradford Hale called Julian Vale and congratulated him before trying to talk business. He said some clients might want commissions, and Julian Vale politely told him he now worked through the gallery only. Naomi Carter later sent me a screenshot from the family group chat that I had already left behind. Celeste Sterling wrote, "She's doing this to humiliate us," because that was easier than saying she was ashamed. For the first time in my life, my father replied to her with honesty. He wrote, "Maybe we should have gone to the wedding," and even that tiny truth felt seismic. My mother answered, "Don't start, Richard," because avoidance had always been her preferred decor. Even with the truth hanging on a gallery wall, no one in my family could say the simplest words. We were wrong. No one wrote them. No one called them aloud. Silence still did the heavy lifting. 2 months after the exhibition opened, a notice appeared in the Connecticut Business Registry. Whitfield Properties, Bradford Hale's family company, had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The details surfaced slowly, then all at once. Failed developments, loan defaults, creditors lining up. The company that made Bradford Hale glitter in my parents' eyes was now a court filing. The consequences hit my parents within weeks and stripped the illusion with brutal efficiency. The mortgage payments stopped. The supplementary card was canceled. My mother's soft landing vanished overnight. Celeste Sterling, who never had to think about money, started selling jewelry online through luxury consignment. The bracelet, the pendant, the trophies she wore as proof that she had chosen correctly. My father called me for the first time since the article, and I knew before answering what it would be. He said he did not know how to say this, then admitted they might lose the house. He said he had no right to ask, but was there any way Julian Vale and I could help? I let the silence sit between us because I needed him to hear it for once. The same silence I heard on my wedding morning when he told me he would not come. Then I told him the truth clearly and without raising my voice. 6 months earlier, he chose Celeste Sterling's party over my wedding and broke a promise that mattered. He let me walk down the aisle with my landlord because showing up for me was not worth the drive. I said I was not automatically refusing help, but he needed to understand something first. I was not his backup plan. I was his daughter, and he had treated me like I was optional. He stayed quiet for a long time, and then he finally said I was right. It was not enough. It did not erase anything. But it was the first honest thing he had said. 2 days later, Celeste Sterling called me for the first time since before the wedding. She began softly, using my nickname, saying she missed me, the old voice she used when she wanted something. Within 30 seconds, the softness cracked, and the real request stepped into the room. Bradford Hale had lost everything. Mom and Dad needed help. Julian Vale and I were doing so well now. She asked whether we could not just move past all of this, as if time were the same as accountability. I asked her calmly what exactly she wanted me to move past. Her scheduling the shower on my wedding day? The calls she made? The way she recruited everyone against me? I asked if she remembered telling Dad I could have a wedding any time because hers mattered more. She fell silent. Then she blamed pregnancy, hormones, fear, and every softer word except the true one. I told her she was calculating, not confused, and I said it without cruelty because facts did not need shouting. Then I told her something I had never said so clearly before. I loved her, but I would never again let love be used as a leash around my neck. If she wanted a relationship with me, it had to start with honesty, not a financial request wrapped in family language. She hung up. She did not call back for 3 weeks, and I did not chase her. I walked into the studio where Julian Vale was finishing the 9th painting in the 7th Chair series. He asked how it went, and I told him she hung up. He nodded and said she would call back changed or not call back at all. Those were the only acceptable options. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of a house I owned outright with Julian Vale. It was a small cottage in Westport, white clapboard, blue shutters, 10 minutes from the water. The ground floor had been converted into Julian Vale's studio with proper ventilation and northern light. There was a porch around the side and a garden where I planned to grow lavender in spring. We paid for that house in full. No mortgage, no help, no one else's name anywhere on the deed. The 7th Chair series had hung at Caldwell for 3 months, and nearly every piece had sold. Total revenue passed $600,000, and the waiting list for Julian Vale's next series kept growing. Vincent Ashcroft offered a second commission. 2 European galleries reached out with serious interest. My own life changed too in a way that felt gentle and poetic rather than dramatic. A major children's publisher offered me a multi-book illustration contract after seeing my work at the Caldwell opening. Someone from their art department recognized my editorial style and reached out the following week. The first book was about a little girl planting wildflowers where nothing was supposed to grow. I illustrated it each morning at the dining table while Julian Vale painted downstairs. Theodore Bennett came for dinner every Sunday in his old Volvo with a bottle of wine and easy company. He sat at our table like he had always belonged there, because in every real sense, he had. One Sunday we served roast chicken with herbs from the garden, and he raised his glass with a smile. He toasted the 7th Chair. Julian Vale clinked his glass. I clinked mine against both of theirs. 7 people came to my wedding, and every single one of them still had a place in my life. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, a car pulled into our driveway without warning. I opened the front door and found Richard Sterling standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets. He looked older than I remembered, not because time had passed, but because regret had weight. He said he had not come to ask for anything, and for once I believed him. He said he came to tell me he was sorry, not the kind that expects forgiveness, the kind that knows better. Then he said something so plain it hurt more because of how late it arrived. He had sat in a country club eating finger sandwiches while his daughter got married with 7 people. He said he would carry that for the rest of his life, and I believed him then too. I told him I knew. Then I said he could stay for coffee because Julian Vale had just made a pot. He walked slowly through the house, pausing at the studio and the garden visible through the back window. In the hallway, he stopped in front of a small study in oil, an early version of June 14th. 7 chairs occupied, 35 empty. He looked at it for a very long time. Then he reached into the bag he was carrying and pulled out a frame. Inside was my old Connecticut statewide art award certificate from years ago, yellowed but intact. He said he found it in the attic and that it should have been on the wall a long time ago. I took it from him and let him stay for coffee, which was not forgiveness, but it was a beginning. People always ask whether I forgave my family, as if forgiveness were a door that opens only once. The truth is that forgiveness is not an event. It is a bridge built one plank at a time. Some days you are laying wood carefully. Some days you stand at the edge and question the crossing. Celeste Sterling eventually wrote me a real letter, pen on paper, mailed with a stamp. It was not perfect, but inside it was the sentence I had waited years to hear. She wrote that she scheduled the shower on my day and that it was not an accident. She admitted she was afraid that if my wedding went well, everyone would stop needing her. I read that line 4 times because at last it sounded like truth instead of strategy. Then I folded the letter and placed it in my desk drawer, not the trash, not a shrine, just a drawer. My mother calls once a week now. She asks about my work, about Julian Vale's paintings, about the garden. She does not ask for money. It is a small thing, but small, honest things rebuild more than grand gestures. Bradford Hale and Celeste Sterling now live in a rented apartment in Stamford and are starting over. Bradford Hale took a position at another firm. Celeste Sterling got her first real job in 6 years. She works as an events coordinator for a nonprofit now, and I heard she is actually good at it. I hope she is. I mean that in the cleanest way possible, without bitterness, without surrendering memory. As for me, I stand on the back porch of a house I paid for myself and watch the evening settle. Julian Vale is in the studio. I can hear the soft scrape of his palette knife through the open window. Theodore Bennett is on his way for Sunday dinner, and the lavender I planted has started to bloom. 42 chairs, 7 people, 417 messages. The numbers sound loud, but they are not the lesson. The lesson is that I stopped counting the people who left and started counting the people who stayed. Self-respect is the quietest form of revenge. You do not need to burn anything down. You only need to stop setting yourself on fire so other people can stay warm in comfort they never earned. If you have ever been the one standing beside empty chairs while someone else got the full room, I see you. You were never invisible. The people who failed to see you were the ones lacking sight, not your worth. Protect your peace. Believe actions. Let silence teach you who values you and who only values access. Choose the people who show up before the applause, before the money, before the headline, before the proof. The right people will stand beside you in a garden full of empty chairs and still make it feel full. The wrong people will miss your wedding and call only when they see a yacht. If love is real, it does not ask you to disappear to keep someone else comfortable. If family is real, it does not need a richer table before it learns your name again. Honor the ones who stay. Release the ones who only return when your life becomes useful. And when the world finally catches up to your worth, do not apologize for being seen at last. That is my story, from the garden in Mystic to the house with lavender and open windows. And that is why I no longer confuse being chosen late with having been loved well all along.